much of the war on terror is framed as a justification on using force in other spaces, in other territories, based on the notion that there's a right to act in self-defense. The general idea is there's an abstract right to defend yourself against any abstract threat that a terrorist organization can present to you wherever they are, which is not how the law works.
No one can act with impunity.
These are crimes that are beyond the pale.
We are talking about human beings. We're not talking about numbers.
We need a court. That's as simple as that.
This is Asymmetrical Haircuts, your international justice podcast with Janet Anderson and Stephanie van den Berg. This episode was produced in partnership with justiceinfo.net.
All rise.
Hi, Janet.
Hi, Steph.
So this episode is my brainchild because we really need to talk about the elephant in the room, the war elephant. When is something a war according to international law?
Yeah, I mean, over the last few months, we've seen these US strikes on boats in international waters off the coast of Venezuela. At the time of recording, what's today, 16th of October, we had yet another strike this week that killed 6 people, suspected drug traffickers, according to Washington. We've seen several of these strikes. Remarkably, the Trump administration actually invoked international law, saying that these strikes were legal because, and this is a great quote that you've managed to pull out, Steph. The Pentagon recently told Congress that Trump has determined the United States is engaged in, quote, a non-international armed conflict, unquote, with drug cartels. So I assume that's going to be the focus of your pod.
Well, yes, after the first of these strikes in the Caribbean Sea happened, our friends over at the Call to the Bar International Law Over Drinks podcast did their episode.
Love them.
Did their episode 51 that we'll link to about the strikes. And I enjoyed it very much and it went into great detail. But I also realized that I don't have the same law, know all the cases by heart background. It was obvious that I needed to get some basics straight about how you legally determine when something is an armed conflict, whether it's national or international, and why does it feature my favorite tribunal so heavily.
Oh my God, you're going to do Tadic, aren't you? And the Yugoslav tribunal.
Well, of course, I am not going to pass up that chance, but it seems like your new favorite court has also been involved. The International Court of Justice, the ICJ, which you're trying to learn more about, also has its own landmark legal opinions. So in order to get us all to talk about our favorite courts and to know what all the background is, I thought I'd invite the Call to the Bar team on that episode to show me the receipts, as it were, and give us a primer on when a war is a war. And we have Tamsin Phillipa Paige, Associate Professor with Deakin Law School. Hi, Tamsin.
Hey, thanks for having me on the podcast, and thank you for the love for Call to the Bar. It's mutual affection.
Ah, wonderful. And we have Alonso Gurmendi Dunkelberg, who is a fellow in human rights at the London School of Economics and Political Science. And most of our listeners will also know him from his Twitter presence and his social media presence, where he likes to beat back the trolls on international law. Hi, Alonso.
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm also a big fan of Call to the Bar, and I'm happy that they invite me often. Yeah, I'm very happy to be here and discuss these topics. Very, very close to my research and to be in Latin American. So
We want to say thank you both for joining us, and particularly Alonso, who I think you just mentioned to me you have a 7-month-old. So obviously if we hear some noise in the back, maybe you've been on paternity leave.
you will definitely hear a few like baby sounds every now and then, or like someone trying to calm down a baby, but like we'll survive.
Let's get into it because you need to get back to your baby. Janet has a fancy lunch somewhere that she needs to get to. So for our kind of basics, I thought maybe the logical jump off point is, why does it matter if you are in a like official armed conflict? And I'm using virtual quotes here, legally.
This goes to your favorite of Tadic. The existence of an armed conflict post World War II has become not a legal state of affairs, but a question of fact. So the idea that you can just declare war and make it so has gone by the wayside. That legally we don't have this distinction between a state of peace and a state of war in diplomatic relations, armed conflict has become a question of fact. And the reason we go to Tadic on this one is for a couple of reasons. The first of all is that lawyers like to try and make complex situations clear and simple. It's what we do, it's what we enjoy doing. We have rules and we like rules and we try and make it clear and simple. So this came up in the Tadic case in a motion to dismiss charges.
Let's then, just for our listeners, give the Tadic background.
Please do, yeah.
So Tadic was the first case at the International Criminal Court for the former Yugoslavia, so a lot of legal stuff needed to be settled in this case. But the background is that Duško Tadic was a Bosnian Serb who was charged with war crimes and crimes against humanity committed during 1992 at the Omarska, Keraterm, and Trnopoje camps, and these are all locations around the Prijedor municipality in Bosnia. And Prijedor was notorious for its detention camps, where thousands of Bosnian Muslims and Bosnian Croat men and sometimes women were held in appalling conditions, and the images of emaciated men huddled behind barbed wire made headline news and drew comparisons at the time with Nazi-era concentration camps. And Tadic was alleged to have been a guard or a visitor to those camps and abusing people. Now we'll go back to why Tadic.
Okay, so this came up particularly because that area was taken over in a relatively bloodless control. The soldiers moved in, there was no fighting in that area when the Bosnian Serbs took control of the region. And so in an early interlocutory motion by the defense to dismiss charges, they argued that the ICTY didn't have jurisdiction because there was no armed conflict there. And so this is where the court, the ICTY had to determine, well, how do we understand where an armed conflict exists so we know whether or not there is an armed conflict going on and therefore Geneva Conventions apply, etc., etc. The argument put forward by Tadic's defense was that there was no armed conflict here and therefore these were just regular murders and therefore not within the scope of the ICTY. What we have there is, particularly in the appeals judge on the defense motion for dismissal, at paragraph 66 to 70, the appeals chamber addresses this question of the existence of an armed conflict, and it goes through the idea that geographical and temporal armed conflicts, and particularly internal armed conflicts, don't refer to the specific areas where there's fighting or not fighting, but to where the parties involved in the fighting are present. So they expand beyond the front lines to the controlled areas until the armed conflict is completed, and in the case of some of the Geneva Conventions around prisoners of war, until all of those prisoners have been returned. So this is where they come to the conclusion that the armed conflict and the existence of an armed conflict is a question of fact, and that's to be judged not on the basis of any political declarations, any statements of parties around how they treat it. That's a question of fact. And that's where we get started with this idea of, if an armed conflict exists, it's a question of fact. And that's why we're starting with Tadic and not with Nicaragua or oil platforms.
So this is the court that decided that this is a question of fact and not a political decision, but there is earlier decisions on the existence of armed conflict and support. And when you're, I think, part of an armed conflict at the ICJ, possibly with the Nicaragua case. So how do these work in unison in this case?
I think there's an important thing to clarify here for whoever's listening that doesn't have a background on this. Much of the war on terror, and maybe I'm jumping a little bit of the explanation that Tamsin was going to give in a second, but let me just frame this for 1 minute. Much of the war on terror is framed as a justification on using force in other spaces, in other territories, based on the notion that there is a right to act in self-defense. We can go into more detail later, but the general idea is there's an abstract right to defend yourself against any abstract threat that a terrorist organization can present to you wherever they are, which is not how the law works.
Absolutely not how the law works.
The war on terror is a legal atrocity. Much of it is based on this idea of self-defense. But whenever a state strikes a terrorist organization in another part of the world, two sets of legal issues pop up. On the one hand, you have the self-defense argument, the the use of force argument, that tackles whether that state has a right to use force vis-a-vis the sovereignty of the other state. Or can you lawfully penetrate the shield of sovereignty to say you have a right to use force in this territory?
Can I add there, it's not just penetrate the right of sovereignty, or the shield of sovereignty, it's also penetrate the prohibition on the use of force in Article 2.4 of the UN Charter, where all uses of force except for self-defense are unlawful, straight up unlawful, and have been since 1945.
Yeah, people don't really realize just how much anti-war the UN Charter is, like anti-use of force. Like, it would be absolutely impossible for states today to gather in a room for like a couple of weeks and produce something remotely as anti-war as the UN Charter. Much of what we're seeing now is the frustration with powers that are expecting to be able to use force a lot and can't because the UN Charter is anti-force. So they're trying to stretch the UN Charter's prohibition on use of force so that they can. And when they do that, they really do a bad job about it, because most states in the world are not the bombers, they are the bombed. So most states in the world don't like being bombed. And so when you
shocked, I tell you.
It's really
don't
weird.
Like being bombed. Shocked.
It's really, really mind-blowing how, like, yeah, people don't like being bombed. And so what ends up happening is that these states tend to create these like very flexible standards for the use of force so that they can bomb other places. And it's basically, you know, a few NATO members and Israel that support these views. Whereas the rest of the world goes and says like, no, this is not legal.
Also Russia, I would say, as well.
Yeah, and Russia. Yeah, fair enough. And every other time, like at one point in time, Colombia supported this against Ecuador, and then the entire Latin America.
You get periodic support from small.
India and Pakistan every now and then also have some similar interaction, but most of the places in the world, like whenever there's a relationship of asymmetry where a country can bomb and the bombed cannot respond, the bombed tends to say, "I don't like being bombed." And so most states will say this kind of dynamic where you can bomb me whenever you want and I can't do anything about it doesn't make a lot of sense, because if I could defend myself, then we would have a war. And what you're saying is that I don't have a right to defend myself when you bomb me, because you're not really bombing me, you're bombing that terrorist organization. And so that's one level of the analysis of the prohibition on the use of force. And then there's the other one, that's the armed conflict. So you can actually say that, sure, you have a right to self-defense to use force in the territory of another state. I don't think that 99% of the war on terror is probably not lawful under the use of force in the UN Charter. But let's assume that there's this one scenario where there's this state that actually is in cahoots with the terrorist organization and is actually, trying to attack another state, and a situation of self-defense pops up. In this circumstance, you still need to factor in the law of armed conflict, meaning once you have permission to pierce the veil of sovereignty and use force under international law lawfully, are you still using that force lawfully against the specific target that you are attacking? This was a big debate with the Soleimani attacks when the United States attacked Soleimani in Iran. These are two levels of legal analysis that we need to engage in.
I have the sense that we could actually just leave these two to just talk and we get a really great podcast out of it. And I'd really, really enjoy it, because I am really enjoying this. I just want to show my ignorance again, as always, and just go back to this very first point that Tamsin made, which is it's not a legal but a factual basis. And you use the Tadic decision to illustrate that. But that's still legal to me in the sense that it was judges, because who decides? I mean, is it just that any official can say we're now at war, and that makes
No.
it factual? And then do they then get lawyers to say, yes, we agree, and under our analysis, and then you get the legal side? So just, I'm being very undergraduate here, and just talk me through it, Tamsin, or Steph, you talk me through it. Somebody talk me through it.
Is this the kind of, it can only be an international armed conflict when it comes from the international armed conflict region of whatever international law situation, where only it would only ever be determined by a judge in court, and then what court could make that determination?
Okay, so this is a question of, despite what cops will try and tell you, law operates in a post environment. It doesn't operate to prevent things. It operates to respond to things in realism. And in an effort of responding, it's trying to prevent it happening in the future. And so, essentially, yes, it's a question that will only then be determined at a factual level by a court eventually if it's disputed. But the question is one of a factual question, of, as put in Tadic, of the hostilities exceed the intensity requirements applicable to it to be an armed conflict. So this is to kind of say, first of all, it needs to reach the armed attack threshold, which I'll cover from Nicaragua and oil platforms, because that's the point at which you get a right to engage in self-defense. Has
cross-border,
there been an
right?
armed Well, cross-border self-defense. You've always got a right to engage in self-defense internally within your borders if someone else has crossed the border. But cross-border external self-defense, the question then is, has there been an armed attack? And there's a whole bunch of stuff around there, the legalese to get into. That's a question, again, where we apply a special test to determine factually, is this an armed attack, or is it something less grave? And similarly here, the question here is, factually, is the intensity of the situation sufficient to be considered an armed conflict? And if it's not, then IHL doesn't apply. And that's the question we have here of, does the question of armed conflict is a question of fact, is factually, do we apply IHL to respond to this situation, or do we apply some sort of domestic, transnational, criminal law, or other sort of diplomatic avenues, whatever it is? Is this a question of determining whether or not there was inappropriate treatment of prisoners of war, or a strike meeting the requirements of proportionality and distinction, or is this a question of murder and torture under some other law because we don't have an armed conflict, so therefore IHL doesn't apply? Does that help answer your question, Jana?
I still have some more to go, so I'll come back to it, but I think Alonso needs to jump in here first.
So I feel it's important to also clarify. Tamsin is saying the law, and I'm saying how states are destroying the law. So I'm going to clarify one thing here.
We're a double act here and a good team.
I know, we always work so well together. So Dungeons and Dragons and international law.
Just to say, that's a side reference to something we'll do a link to, the Opinio Juris seminar symposium on popular culture. So just hold, don't stop the podcast to get into that, but come back to it later.
We are sort of wrongly used to the situation where I was mentioning that there's a conflation between use of force and IHL, armed conflict law, at the same time, because most of what states are doing now involves, one, a non-state armed group, like a terrorist organization, let's say, and two, cross-boundary use of force. That is not what each of these bodies of law were meant to address 100% of the times. So what was use of force meant to address? Use of force was meant to address when the UN Charter was signed, and there's a very interesting article by Adil Haq on this. Essentially, a state attacks another state, right? And so when can a state use force in self-defense? And the main reasons, the main justifications for using use of force were very simple.
Can I build on that? It's not just when can a state use force in self-defense, but when has a state violated the prohibition on aggression as well. That it existed for that dual purpose.
So you could use force in another territory, in another country, when you had the consent of that state, when you had the authorization of the Security Council, or when you had engaged in, like Tamsin says, in a violation of the prohibition on the use of force, and so the other state had a right to defend itself against that aggression. So essentially, all war is illegal unless it is authorized by the state in question or the Security Council. All other events are unlawful. Someone is using force unlawfully, and someone has a right to defend itself. Right? And that's it. That's the law on self-defense. Tamsin's like, more or less.
Noting that the law on self-defense also says that any self-defense has to be proportional to the threat faced, which is really important when we get to how people are using the use of force.
Proportional, necessary, and all of those things. Yeah, the way you exercise force also matters. True. Then you have international humanitarian law, specifically non-international armed conflicts, which are those that apply between a state and a non-state armed group, or between non-state armed groups among themselves. Why does that law exist? It doesn't really exist so that the US can attack Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. It generally exists because international law accepts that sometimes societies get convulsed in armed violence. And sometimes that violence is like right now, like today in Peru, like I'm Peruvian, there are protests going on, and we Peruvians, we like to burn stuff up. I was not going to say stuff. I don't know if I'm allowed to say bad words in this podcast.
Yes.
We like to burn shit up. So some stuff is being burned in Peru. So that creates a situation of turmoil internally. But that situation of turmoil has to be handled through human rights law and through domestic law. You cannot just, the police can't go and shoot someone in the face because they are engaging in violent protest.
Unless, of course, they work for ICE in the US, where apparently anything fucking goes right now.
At the moment, we have all these states saying things are a war, saying they have the right to do all these things. How do you see this idea of people coming out and saying, they could do this shit, without having a justification? Why do you think this language is important to them?
So I have a couple of sets of reasons here. First of all is you have to sell it to your own population. And selling any protracted use of force, violence, what have you, requires a narrative that your population will get behind. And Lakoff did some really cool literary theory stuff on this in relation to Iraq 1 and Iraq 2. Basically, selling a war or any sort of protracted use of force, or whatever we're going to call a war, to a population follows the same narrative structure as a fairy tale. So what you have here is a victim who is being overwhelmed by an evil and inhuman other that is evil and overwhelming and powerful, but yet will inevitably be defeated by the hero. The hero is also sometimes the victim. Not always, but sometimes. And then you have these tales of all of the awful things that the villains are doing to justify the action against them, that also justify both why they are overwhelming and powerful and evil, but also why they inevitably must be defeated. Your hero then has all of their actions justified by society because they are fighting that greater evil to this end point of happily ever after that is being sold. That's the propaganda narrative that pretty much every single war follows across cultures. So this is why we call it a war on drugs. You can sell police brutality if it's a war on the drugs. That's not going to affect me. We're the victims here. You can sell it as a war on terror, even though it's just a whole bunch of organized bombing campaigns of farmers in the Middle East and Afghanistan, because you're selling it as a war against this overwhelming evil of the terrorists.
I mean, the war on drugs is also bombing farmers in Latin America. So
Exactly, yeah. So it's a case of any of these things, you can sell that to your domestic population to keep doing it and to keep throwing money at it and to keep throwing lives of soldiers and whoever at it, and to keep justifying the number of deaths that occur and all of that through a war narrative. Why do we keep invoking international law? Because you also have to sell it to your domestic populace, but you also need to sell it to your allies. And if you can't convince your allies to at least do nothing to stop you, then you can't keep doing this thing that you want to do, that you're justifying with this fairy tale narrative, propaganda narrative. And the better narrative, the better way ones will convince your allies to get on board and join you, as we saw with the coalition of the willing and a lot of the war on drugs. But in other ways, like we see currently with Israel, I think at this point in time, they've violated the ceasefire that's been in place for like 2 days, multiple times already at this point in time. And their 2 years of ongoing genocide in Palestine, most of their allies, while not buying that they're engaged in self-defense and a war, which they're not.
I have to flag, you don't see this because we're obviously audio, not video, but there's,
a lot of air quotes.
A lot of air quotes in this.
Their allies are not necessarily buying their justifications, but they have enough plausible deniability to look the other way. And that's why states invoke the war narrative for domestic propaganda and the international law narrative for their allies.
I know, Alonso, you have opinions, capital letters, all of them, about the war on drugs and the fact that states have been doing this for a while and only now are we kind of cottoning on. They're doing that because you've seen it all happen in Latin America.
There is a phenomenon that's now happening with the war on terror. This was not what I was going to say, so I'm I'm sidetracking. But there is a phenomenon in the war on terror where the United States and other war on terror, like NATO states, have sort of realized that if they bomb a country, that goes onto CNN. And, oh no, the United States bombed some Somalia, right? So the quote unquote proper way to bomb Somalia so that you can get away with it is to not actually declare war on Somalia. You just find yourself a very helpful dictator somewhere. Let's say Kenya, very close to Somalia. And you tell the Kenyan dictator to bomb fishermen in Somalia. And all of a sudden that doesn't make it to CNN. Because it's Kenya attacking Somalia. Who cares about that? That is how the war on drugs has existed for the past, 50 years. Because it's Colombia, bombing farmers. It's Peru, executing, drug dealers. Who cares? Right? But all of a sudden now it's the United States using an F-35 to bomb a little boat off the coast of Venezuela. And that matters. And I'm thinking the entire region in Latin America has these shoot down laws, leyes de derribo in Spanish, where basically they say that if you have a little biplane, one of those little planes in the jungle that don't need a actual runway to land, every single state in South America and many in Central America have laws that allow them to shoot down those planes if there's suspicion of them carrying drugs. So they will communicate with the pilot, they will say land, and the pilot will not respond. And so then there's a set of escalation procedures that can end up with just shooting down a plane. That has happened many times before. The United States stopped supporting this because in 2000, it accidentally collaborated to the shooting down of a bunch of missionaries that had a faulty radio in Peru. So the United States sort of stopped doing it. And then Trump went no, I love this policy. Let's keep on shooting planes. So, but even when the United States was not helping us shoot down little planes, we in Latin America, we were still doing it a lot. And no one cares. No one has ever, I'm the only one who's written an article in English about these shoot down laws in Latin America because it doesn't make it to the news. I did want to engage with what Tamsin is saying about stories and the power of tales. Because it is true. We like to think of the law as this as lawyers in law school, professors tell us, the law is a bunch of neutral rules that will help solve controversies. And you really do, when you're getting into law school, you're wide-eyed, I want to change the world. You do feel okay, this is this neutral set of rules. It's amazing. It really isn't. It takes a long time to realize, but it really isn't that. It is part of a trick that language does to affect reality. It has a performative function. When you had a terror attack, the natural response didn't used to be go to war. I often hear what was Israel supposed to do other than a massive war with genocidal consequences in response to October 7th? And I think, but why was war the only solution that you can think of in response to a terror attack? It didn't used to be like that. When diplomatic staff from the United States was taken hostage in Tehran, the United States did not invade Tehran. The biggest thing it tried to do was special ops to try to rescue the hostages. Entebbe worked like that as well. When there were hostages, Israeli hostages in Uganda, Israel did not tell the United States, go invade Uganda and like kill a bunch of Ugandans. They did the Entebbe raid, famously. Not strictly speaking legal, but like, it was not a genocidal war. War was not the go-to answer to terrorism for a very long time. And it's important to understand how discourses have changed the meaning of this like war on terror and stuff like that. Take my country, for example, Peru. Janet was mentioning how like I always fight with trolls. My time fighting trolls started fighting off Peruvian trolls that were very angry that I wrote a book saying that Peru's counterterrorism policies, counterinsurgent policies against the Shining Path, the MRTA, and in the 1980s and 90s were legally an armed conflict. The entire Peruvian right wing hated me because I said that, because apparently if you said that there was an armed conflict with a non-state armed group, you were legitimizing that group. You were giving them belligerent recognition, belligerent rights. You were saying that they were special, that they had more rights to attack the state. You were being pro-terrorist. And then 9/11 happened. And the United States said, no, you know what? Actually, we are in an armed conflict against a non-state armed group called Al-Qaeda. What does that mean? It means that I can bomb all of Afghanistan, that I can bomb Iraq, and that I can deploy massive amounts of violence that I wasn't able before because I'm at war.
Not just that, because of the non-state actor thing, there was a revolving door of how are we going to treat them? They're not really covered by the Geneva Convention, but they're also not really covered by
the unlawful enemy combatant thing.
Another thing, unlawful enemy combatant. And so we'll create this fictitious gray zone where they have neither the rights of a civilian nor the rights of a combatant, so we can just drop them all in lightless black sites and torture the shit out of them. This was considered like the solution to the problem, and it's fucking wild that this was the solution, and we call these civilized nations.
I can see what the badge is going to be for this podcast already. It's going to include a variety of expletives on it.
I did want to finish my point about language, because then now, post 9/11 in Peru, after winning the armed conflict against the Shining Path is just a really, really tiny organization now that is splintered into several groups. The only group that is still operating militarily in Peru is called the Militarized Communist Party of Peru, the MPCP. And this group operates at a fraction of the intensity of conflict that the original Shining Path did. It's basically now the bodyguards of drug dealers, the paid bodyguards of drug dealers. That's the biggest thing it'll do. Sure, it has its propaganda machine and it says that it's engaged in the revolutionary war of what, yada, yada, yada. It isn't. It's organized crime. But the same people that troll me for saying that there was an armed conflict in Peru in the 1990s and 1980s against the big Shining Path are now the biggest proponents of treating the MPCP as a party in an armed conflict with Peru. It is an absolute glaring, stupid contradiction of people that say when the Shining Path was at its highest power in Peru, that was not an armed conflict. But now that it's almost defeated, now there is an armed conflict. Why? What happened? What happened was the narrative of the war on terror convinced states that being in an armed conflict wasn't actually about giving legitimacy to the armed group, but rather it was about being able to use this disproportionate force and this like unlawful enemy combatant rationale against non-state armed groups. You no longer needed to comply with human rights standards. You had to comply with war standards. So you can just shoot to kill. And that's a change of heart that is really mind-blowing to me. People are very convinced in Peru that that is a reasonable projection, to be against armed conflict in the 80s, but in favor of armed conflict in the 2020s. Because of the narrative, the selling power of the war on terror narrative changed perspectives completely. And so now it's gotten to a point where now I was talking about these protests that are currently now in Peru happening. There's many actors now in Peru trying to push the narrative that these protests are connected to terrorism, are connected to terrorist factions, so that the police doesn't need to use human rights standards, so that they can start shooting at protesters like point blank. So terrorism has become a story, a narrative to allow states to use disproportionate force and not have, due process guarantees for people in situations where this was never meant to be the case. The law of non-international armed conflict was not meant to replace policing and, counterterrorism. It was meant to deal with situations of near civil war, not, crime. So the narrative, the language, the story has changed, and that is terrible for human rights.
And on the note of that, in the threshold of how you get from policing to belligerency, Rob McLaughlin wrote a really great book that deals with all of those stages from minor civil unrest to the point of belligerency and where those legal thresholds were. And for how we decide what is terrorism, Austin Turk wrote a fantastic article called The Sociology of Terrorism that actually unpacks how those decisions are made about whether or not we call something terrorism or crime.
We're going to have to wrap up this podcast, but I did promise at the top that we would also talk about ICJ Nicaragua. So
just before Tamsin jumps in, I'm going to have to jump out at some point. So I'm carrying on listening, and I'll listen to the rest of the podcast. But I'm going to let Steph do all of the wrapping up from here.
Nicaragua
and oil platforms. So I'm actually going to go with oil platforms because I like oil platforms for use ad bellum more than I like Nicaragua, because oil platforms confirms the question of Nicaragua that that armed attack is only the most grave uses of force. And they then unpack, well, did that most grave use of force exist in the case of the oil platform? So a bit of factual history here. There was an accusation that Iran shot a Silkworm land-to-sea missile at a US-flagged vessel, and sinking. I think it sunk the vessel, but it hit the vessel. And then in response to that, the US fired upon and destroyed two currently inoperable at the time of the attack Iranian oil platforms in the Persian Gulf. And this had ICJ jurisdiction because of a 1955 treaty between the US and Iran on provision of commerce, which had a dispute resolution clause that took it to the ICJ. This is how we have an ICJ jurisdiction. And so the question then before the ICJ was, did Iran use force against the US, enlivening a right to self-defense? And if no, was Iran entitled to compensation for disruption of commerce under the treaty? So,
is this that famous Amity Treaty? That's like the basis for almost every Iran-US case that I've ever seen.
It is that exact treaty. So yes, so we have that treaty, and Iran, if US has put forward a bunch of really circumstantial evidence on the missile strike, which the court concludes there is no factual basis to attribute that to Iran. However, what they do conclude is that firing upon a vessel with a missile would meet a threshold of armed attack, the scale and effects test that says the scale and effect of the attack was sufficiently grave to constitute an armed attack, which is the gravest form of attack we can constitute. But we can't attribute that to Iran here because your evidence is bullshit. To paraphrase the court over about 10 paragraphs. What they then get to is a whole bunch of other cumulative incidences which the US is saying when all of these are put together, we have a cumulative threshold of armed attack, and the court pretty much rejects that idea of doing that. So, because at paragraph 64, they say that because there was some mine laying that that damaged a US ship, they say even taking cumulatively and reserving, as already noted, the question of Iranian responsibility, these incidences do not seem to the court to constitute an armed attack. And that they're even taken cumulatively is a sign of skepticism from the court about the US idea that cumulative threshold armed attack exists, which is the basis for the statements of the war on drugs being an armed conflict. The court says no. But then you also then have to demonstrate attribution for every individual incident. So what we have here is a set of laws that started in Nicaragua, but really kind of got crystallized with the oil platforms case, that says an armed attack is only the most grave form of military use of force. That's the threshold to engage in self-defense. And self-defense then must be proportional to the harm suffered or faced by the armed attack, and it must be the only reasonably necessary response to the armed attack in order to repel and prevent the armed attack from continuing. And they were citing Nicaragua to get to that point, and this is why I like oil platforms. It's a bit less opaque than Nicaragua.
I would add to that what we're seeing with the United States in the war on drugs, with these like vessels in the sea, is that this set of rules, Nicaragua and oil platforms, it was not designed to deal with these little boats in the sea. It was designed to deal with states. So in Nicaragua, there's a whole section trying to attribute whether a state can actually be responsible for the acts of a non-state actor. And there's different attribution tests, like there's a overall and effective control depending on which tribunal you go to.
Can I clarify that? Overall control is for international criminal law. Effective control is for jus ad bellum.
That's a whole nother podcast,
It is.
right?
Whole
there.
nother podcast, but that's your separation of overall versus effective control. Effective control is jus ad bellum and state control. Overall control is command responsibility, international criminal law control.
And if essentially then what you have is the denaturalization of the use of force regime to say that requirement sort of is no longer needed, or is so tenuous that all that is needed is a lack of interest in doing it yourself. So Venezuela isn't bombing fishermen, therefore we need to bomb the fishermen. And that's just nowhere in the law. That's just sort of made up in air now. I don't really think that the use of force set of rules should be even applied to what the United States is doing to the little fishing vessels off the coast of Venezuela, because it was not meant for that.
The extent of engagement with the use of force that we should have is there is no basis for a use of force. What crimes are the people responsible committing as a result? That's the extent of engagement that we should be giving it, because saying that there's a war doesn't make it fucking so. Quite simply. And that then doesn't give you this authority to just go and blow shit up.
Even being devil's advocate here and saying, no, there is an armed conflict. Transporting drugs is not participation in hostilities. So even if they were right, and they are not, that there would be some kind of like armed conflict, they would still be executing criminals. Because like when there's an armed conflict, the typical example would be robbing a bank. If Peru is in an armed conflict with the Shining Path wants to take over Peru, and Peru doesn't want the Shining Path to take over Peru. And then in that context, you rob a bank, should the police shoot at you to kill as if you were a member of the Shining Path? No, because you're not really participating in the Shining Path's hostilities. You still exist separate to the armed conflict because you're committing a normal crime. It's the same with these boats, right? They are transporting drugs. What element of transporting drugs, even assuming that they are, because most likely they're just fishermen. or even worse, like migrants trying to get to the US, and the US is using this as an excuse to kill migrants. There goes my visa. Even if they were right, and this would be an armed conflict, they would still be executing criminals. And that's just not what armed conflict was created to address.
Okay, that's your final point. Then, Tamsin, do you want to have a final point? And then we're going to move on to the asymmetrical haircuts questions.
My final point would be that the law exists for a reason, and it tries to contain what we can and can't do. But generally, what actually happens is we have a game of manipulation, as we're seeing here, from every power with more guns than the people they don't like, to try and justify what they're doing as being within the rules, but what their enemies are doing as being outside of the rules, and therefore permitting whatever the response people want. And it's not okay, and we need to see more courage from governments who are supposedly allies or neutral parties saying that it's not okay, because otherwise we will see the UN go the same way as the League of Nations, and as every day that goes past, that's looking more and more likely. And as someone who has spent more time than most anyone else in the world dealing with the UN Security Council's behavior, that's terrifying. And I just thought the Security Council was terrifying until this all started happening.
Thank you both so much. We have switched up our asymmetrical haircuts question, and I'm trying to make this question work, and Janet is kind of against it, but now that she has left, I get to do whatever the heck I want. My new asymmetrical haircuts question, we used to ask you for your favorite court case, but now I like to ask you about your best or maybe weirdest job you had.
As people who may be aware of that, I spent a good long while as a French-trained fine dining pâtissière, which involved making the desserts for a lot of fine dining restaurants in Australia. They were all over here 2 and 3 hat, which would have made them about 1 or 2 Michelin stars in a European context, which involved a lot of crazy shit. There was that time I fired an apprentice because they were cutting their speed on chopping board and not the bench, and we don't want to waste good product getting into clients' food. There was that time a sous chef had taken too much speed and set fire to me in the middle of service. And there was so many occasions of just random casual violence occurring within fine dining restaurants that I would tell anyone who likes watching Gordon Ramsay because they think he's a psycho. He is a psycho, I know from experience, but he tones it down for TV.
Oh.
That is a tough act to follow on, so I grant you
I
that.
knew I was not. My professional life has been like very boring. You should have asked me like, what's the craziest thing you've done for a Comic-Con or something like that. I don't think I have a very like weird thing that I've done. I've mostly been a law firm lawyer and then an academic, so not exactly particularly weird. So the weirdest thing I've done as part of like my professional experience was when I was working at an NGO, human rights NGO, one of the big ones. I was an intern. My job basically consisted, and this sort of taught me how to like protect my mental health as a academic and as a like someone who deals with human rights. My job consisted of looking at the news in a specific part of Colombia where there was a lot of organized crime, and so we were trying to map unlawful executions. And there's a thing in Colombia called the Casa de Pique, which is a place where the violence gets so horrible that they don't just kill you. This is about like who gets to sell what where, and so racketeering. So basically different armed groups and different organized crime organizations allow you to operate in a specific part of town, and if you don't, or if you pay the wrong person or whatever, or you don't have money to pay, you get in trouble, and then eventually there's a war between groups, and then it gets ugly. And what happens in these Casas de Pique is they chop people up as a message, right? And my job basically was to see the news and try to figure out how many people we were talking about, because body parts would wash up in the shores. And so there would be like, I would need to count, for example, today, 3 arms were found in the shore. The next day, 2 legs. The next day, 1 more arm and 1 torso. And so I would need to count those up so that we could have like an
figure out how many people you could reconstruct with them.
That is the weirdest thing I've done for money. Actually, it was an internship, so it wasn't for money, but like, for professional stuff.
Okay, I think this is a nice segue in what we do to get away from international law, or what books what books or movies or podcasts you recommend. Obviously, we all recommend your own podcast, and you walked us through a lot of books linked to the subjects we were talking about. So maybe we can use this to understand what you watch, read, or listen to not have to deal with the horrors of the world sometimes.
Okay, so I have a bit of a love affair with the fiction of Seanan McGuire, both in her Seanan McGuire actual thing, but also under her various pen names, in particular Mira Grant, and the steampunk fiction of Gail Carriger, which both very different in their theme, dark and twisty for Seanan McGuire's stuff, but very dramatic, beautifully written, and just generally amazing. Gail Carriger's stuff she describes as the cupcakes of literature, and they're amazing. And if you ever just want to unwind in a steampunk universe that's built on the premise that the only way a weird little country off the coast of Europe could have colonized the entire world is if they integrated vampires and werewolves into their political and military systems, Gail Carriger's you go to.
Oh, that sounds like my next binge read. Alonso.
So the way I distance myself from academia is weird, because like I read so much for a living that reading itself becomes a little bit of a problem. So like I don't read as much as I would like. The media that I consume is more visual. The more readable stuff that I do is I read comic books. I really do enjoy comic books. And then I watch a lot of movies, and I watch a lot of TV and shows like that to distract me. One comic book that I think is very understated, people don't give it enough credit, is I think it was 2017 run of the Flintstones. It's unexpected, but it is fantastic, because it is a social critique of modern times through the eyes of the Flintstones. So for example, Fred and Wilma are this new thing, this like unnatural thing that in the cave years, it wasn't supposed to be like that. It was unnatural to be monogamous. And so you were supposed to be polygamous. You were supposed to live in this like natural state of like one man and many women. And then Fred and Wilma are like the weird ones. And it's an allegory for LGBT rights. There's also like Fred and Barney. They have this like society, the I don't know the name in English because I watched this in Spanish, but the blue buffalo helmets. They turned that into a veterans society. And so they are veterans from a war. What war? The war against the Neanderthals. And so Fred actually committed genocide against the Neanderthals. And he has a lot of trauma about that. And he talks about that with Barney. And so like, it sounds like...
This is taking a wild turn.
Yeah, but it is a fantastic critique of the modern world by making you feel like the things that make the modern world, the normal of the modern world, is the weird thing of the Flintstones bedrock era, right? So it's really good. It's also great.
Have you read the fan theory that the Flintstones and the Jetsons are actually set in the same world, and the Flintstones are on Earth while the Jetsons are above, and the Flintstones are like doing all the labor to support the utopian space society?
Yeah, this is why Tamsin is the coolest, man. Yes, I've heard that.
I have not seen the Jetson Flintstone fan fiction theories, and I'm definitely missing out, it turns out.
Yeah, because the humans and dinosaurs are not meant to coexist, right? So how did that happen? It's because the Jetsons did some genetic tampering.
Okay. Oh, wow. Yeah. Okay. And my mind is a little blown right now, but thank you both so much for enriching me, not only with this new Flintstones Jetsons perspective, which I'm definitely going to debut over dinner, with my husband and my kid, who will find this super amusing. But thank you also for getting into when is a war, and for sitting down with us and explaining this. When we have more 101 questions that we hear you talk about over on your podcast, I'm sure I'm going to invite you back over. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you as well for having me.
This was Asymmetrical Haircuts, your international justice podcast. Created and presented by Janet Anderson and Stephanie Vandenberg. This episode was created in partnership with justiceinfo.net, an independent site covering justice efforts for mass violence, and with the Hague Humanity Hub. Music is by autonautics.com. You can find show notes and everything about the podcast on asymmetricalhaircuts.com. This show is available on every major podcast service, so please subscribe, give us a rating, and spread the word.